For 46 years, war raged among England and France and the American colonies. On the frontier of the competing empires lay central New Brunswick and the great river running through it. As the conflicts continued, the region became a refuge for both French Acadians and British Loyalists. Hunters had lived here for thousands of years. A recently identified Clovis Point was probably used on a spear by an unidentified people living here at least 10,000 years ago. By 1600, the Maliseets, an Algonquian-speaking people, dominated the area. The Maliseets were hunters who lived in family groups. They traveled in their swift birch-bark canoes, propelled by crafted paddles, which they sometimes decorated. Every spring they gathered as a community just west of Fredericton, under the leadership of their chiefs. Sometimes they would go to war against a common enemy. They'd been converted by French Catholic missionaries at an early period and had a chapel at Meductic in which this bell was used. The Maliseet controlled the countryside above Fredericton and usually worked in alliance with the French authorities. From the time of Champlain, the St. John River Valley had been part of the French Empire in North America, called Acadia. Few Acadians lived here, but when threatened by the English, the French governor would sometimes retreat into the valley. Governor Villebon built a small fort at the point where the Nashwauk River enters the St. John. Some years later, a number of Acadians left Nova Scotia and built a settlement on the Fredericton Intervale, which they called St. Anne. In 1759, St. Anne was attacked by a company of Massachusetts Rangers, traditional enemies of the French. The Rangers burned the settlement and murdered several inhabitants of the area, including women and children. Most of the rest fled northward. At war's end, France surrendered this whole area to England. English settlers from Massachusetts, called planters, were given lands along the north side of the St. John River. Their community was Majorville and was built on the broad St. John River intervales, which flooded each spring. There they built a distinctive congregational church. One of them, James Simons, even sat in the Nova Scotia legislature. Peace following the 7 Years' War was short-lived. Soon the small settlements were caught up in the American Revolution. Most planters sided with the rebels. However, the English forces prevailed in the conflict, holding Nova Scotia against American efforts to make it the 14th state. The fate of the Middle Valley was finally decided at the end of the Revolution. It would remain British. It would become a refuge for those fleeing the revolutionaries, a military outpost facing the victorious Americans. Thousands of those who had supported the English cause in the American colonies fled from New York and settled in the region. They became known as Loyalists. Loyalist civilians were settled on land grants below Fredericton. A dozen Loyalist regiments were given military grants above the city to defend against the Maliseets and the Americans. Acadians, already living at Kingsclear above Fredericton, were offered lands upriver at what would become Edmundston. The Maliseet were brought together and provided with a reserve within the parish. The British government now divided Nova Scotia to create the new Loyalist Crown Colony of New Brunswick. The first governor was Colonel Thomas Carleton, whose brother had commanded the British Army at New York during the Revolution. Carleton chose St. Anne, now named Fredericton, to be his capital. The Central Valley became the counties of York and Sunbury, and these in turn were divided into parishes with names like Kingsclear and Majorville and St. Mary's. So begins the story of York and Sunbury. Most Loyalists came with little more than the shirts on their backs. For a time, they were fed by the British military. Slowly, their settlement took root. They cleared land, made small farms, cut timber, and lived modestly. Their values were ones of loyalty and of all things British. The government, the political traditions, the military, the Church of England, all bespoke the high value placed on loyalty and order. The riverfront of the small provincial capital was dominated by the symbols of imperial power. At the lower end of Fredericton was the parish church, replaced in 1853 by the cathedral. Just above it was Province House, where the legislature met. Beyond this was the military compound with its officers' quarters. Still further up the river, Governor Carleton built his mansion. Later, on the hill behind the town, arose New Brunswick's Oxford, King's College. The main source of income in the early years came from the military and from the officers of the Crown, men like John Saunders, a Virginian who served as captain in the Loyalist forces. Saunders founded an estate called the Barony and became the Chief Justice of New Brunswick. His wife was Ariana, the daughter of the commander of the Maryland Loyalists. Like other Loyalist office holders, they had prestige, a good income, and lived well. In the generation following the Loyalist settlement, the economy stagnated, only to recover when Napoleon cut off England's vital timber supplies. Then, the British government looked to New Brunswick, and soon 40% of all British timber came from the province. Timber and ships from central New Brunswick were sold in London and Liverpool and Greenock, and shiploads of British goods were brought to stock the stores of Fredericton. Farmers in Kingsclear borrowed from merchants in Fredericton, who in turn borrowed from merchants in Liverpool. Everybody was in debt to everybody else in this great trading chain. After 1815, timber ships often returned with British migrants seeking new opportunities and free land. Many of these newcomers were English and Scots, but the largest group was Irish. By the 1840s, the British and their children outnumbered the Loyalists. Most newcomers took land grants in rural areas. Settlements, like Harvey and Stanley, emerged from the inland wilderness. The Stanley settlement was made by British capitalists who bought vast tracts of land and sold lots to British settlers. The watercolors show the development of the Stanley settlement from the arrival of the surveyors to the clearing of the land, the building of the sawmill, and the beginnings of farms. British newcomers brought their distinctive institutions with them. With the Scots and Irish came the Presbyterian Church. With the Irish came the Roman Catholic. St. Paul's Kirk and Old St. Dunstan's Church in Fredericton were built to serve the new arrivals. For a short time, St. Dunstan's was the cathedral church for the Roman Catholic Bishop of New Brunswick. Other evidence of the British presence was found in the sectarian strife in the 1840s, when soldiers from the garrison were used to control riots between Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. There were often social and political tensions between the establishment and those who felt excluded. Sometimes these feelings were expressed by political opposition to the governor's party, which dominated the government. Sometimes the opposition was from religious dissenters like the Methodists and the Baptists, who protested against the privileged position of the Church of England. For example, in the 1850s, both a Methodist church and an Anglican cathedral were being built. The leading Methodist was L.A. Wilmot, a prominent political reformer. He saw to it that the Methodist church was larger than Bishop Medley's cathedral and that its steeple stood higher. But these were minor issues. In its first century, Fredericton and its hinterland, above all, remained loyal. Things began to change after 1860. There was Confederation. The imperial garrison was withdrawn. A new political reform movement, called the Smashers, took control. They wanted railways and free schools. Progress was their mantra. New settlements followed the railways rather than the rivers, creating communities like Macadam, Fredericton Junction, and Napadogan. The Smashers pushed for local control, and York and Sunbury got elected county councils. Amid great bitterness, the Smashers pushed through compulsory, free, non-sectarian schools for every child. In Fredericton, the Charlotte Street and later the York Street schools were built to accommodate the students in this new order. After great debate, The Catholics of the city were allowed to have their own separate school, St. Dunstan's, which was rented by the public school board. The York County debtors' prison was abolished, and prohibition imposed, as the smashers tried to regulate the consumption of alcohol. Farms became larger and more profitable, as many farmers invested in new farm machines and selective breeding of farm animals. Agricultural exhibitions were mounted each year in most villages to encourage quality of output, and provincial exhibitions were mounted in great exhibition palaces beginning in 1852. The great exhibitions also showed off the industrial development of central New Brunswick. Industrial change in the region was dramatic. The great stimulus was the railway. In the last third of the 19th century, Greater Fredericton became a manufacturing center. Smokestacks competed with steeples as factories turned out iron and steel, agricultural implements, carriages, shoes, cloth, and canoes. The face of the age was Alexander "Boss" Gibson. The child of Irish immigrants, Gibson was a humble lumberman who became the largest timber baron in the province. He built his own town at Marysville, complete with lumber mills, company store, homes for his workers, and the railway bridge to Fredericton. He participated in building 3 railways from Fredericton, to Fredericton Junction, to Edmundston, and to Chatham. From the land subsidies received for his railways, Boss Gibson accumulated more than 1 million acres of timberlands in the province. Finally, he established the Marysville Cotton Mill, one of the largest industrial enterprises in the province, and constructed the distinctive company houses which surround the mill. He even built his own Methodist church in Marysville. Gibson employed 2,000 men and women in his enterprises. When he died, in 1913, he was a pauper. The triumph of reform and technology did not change the old attitudes and ways of thinking. Imperialism was central to the identity of most people. Victoria was queen. In the 1880s, many people wanted to create a united British Empire. The leading advocate was the principal of Fredericton High School, Sir George Parkin, who later became secretary of the Rhodes Scholarship Trust. Many young men from the region fought for the empire in the South African Boer War in 1900. To support the British cause, the women of Fredericton formed a patriotic society called the Imperial Order Daughters of the Empire. Finally, when the guns of August sounded in 1914, there was no question where the loyalties of the people of central New Brunswick lay. Thousands of young men volunteered for service overseas, and many of them never returned. In units like the York Regiment, they fought and died at Vimy Ridge. Times were not easy after the Great War. A whole generation of young men left the Central Valley for Europe. Many returned home to face a serious economic depression. Few would return to life on the farm. In the end, many left for greener pastures in Western Canada or in the Boston States. And so ended the Third Age. It began in the worst of times. The Great Depression started in 1929 and continued for a decade. There were few jobs, no security, and few public support systems. Many people returned to the farms just to get enough to eat. The Depression only ended with the Second World War in 1939. The continuing theme was devotion to the British Empire. In the midst of the Great Depression, Premier John McNair declared that New Brunswick was a province of Great Britain. When the Nazi forces rolled across Europe in 1939 and 1940, and Britain stood alone against Hitler, thousands of young people from central New Brunswick again came to the defense of the motherland. Lord Beaverbrook, the New Brunswick boy who built the RAF at the height of the Battle of Britain, still dreamed of a great, united British Empire. He served as Chancellor of the University and devoted his great fortune to the people of central New Brunswick. He provided scholarships, public buildings, and art galleries. Change began at the war's end. At its heart was the federal decision to provide social programs for all Canadians. Ottawa put money in the hands of individuals and granted subsidies to the province. These new public resources were used to build two of the largest institutions in the British Commonwealth. The first was the military base at Gagetown with its model town of Oromocto, and the second, the 3,000-student Fredericton High School. The influence of the state was greatly expanded. Amid great bitterness, Premier Louis Robichaud abolished county councils and centralized control of health, schools, and welfare. The University of New Brunswick, under Colin Mackay, grew from a small college with a few hundred students to a complex university with many thousands. St. Thomas University was brought to Fredericton. The large Chalmers Hospital became the regional health centre. Development projects were undertaken with the construction of the Mactaquac Dam and the paper mill and town of Nakawik. These changes came at a cost. 19 farming communities were destroyed to build Camp Gagetown, and hundreds of farms above Fredericton were destroyed to build the dam. To provide these services, there was a dramatic growth in public service jobs, while employment in agriculture and industry declined. The Marysville Cotton Mill became a civil service office building. The population of central New Brunswick more than doubled in the period. The city of Fredericton, which had been confined to the downtown Platte in 1945, expanded to the top of the hill. The suburban villages were amalgamated with the city. By 1990, nearly 8 out of every 10 people in York County lived in Greater Fredericton. People now lived on farms, but didn't farm for a living. The great railway systems were demolished and replaced by large highways. Most people, wherever they lived, now drove to Fredericton or Oromocto for work. With the growth of jobs and population came an influx of newcomers. Notable was the return of an Acadian community to Fredericton. After the passage of the Official Language Acts, its members became an important part of the public service. The symbol of their return was the creation of St. Anne des Pays-Bas Church, named after a church burned in 1759. And yet, despite these changes, Greater Fredericton, by 1990, still resembled central New Brunswick in 1830. Agriculture, industry, and railways gave way to government and service industries. The garrison returned. The population of the region remained largely British in origin and tradition, with Acadian and Maliseet minorities. Only this time, the centre of the empire was Ottawa, not London.